Hi, my name is Jenny Feick. Welcome to the fifth in a series of educational videos for the Great Divide Trail Association. This is the first of 4 video webinars on the fauna or animals of the Great Divide. This one focuses on some of the invertebrates. I'll just get rid of these meeting controls here. The Great Divide Trail Association is committed to reconciliation, which starts by taking this and every opportunity to acknowledge our honor and privilege to live, work, and play within Treaty 7 territory. We honor and acknowledge that the GDT passes through traditional Indigenous territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Ayahe Nakota, the Tsuut'ina, Cree, Shewepma, Clay Dena, Tanaha, Sinixt, and Métis. The Great Divide Trail Association would like to thank and invite you to advocate for what you love and to preserve nature for future generations to enjoy while educating yourself and others on Indigenous history and perspectives. This video is the 5th in a series of natural history-oriented presentations called the Nature of the Great Divide series. This Nature of the Great Divide talk focuses on an important group of animals you might encounter along the Great Divide, the invertebrates, specifically the worms and freshwater mollusks. Although small and obscure, these creatures have a huge effect on Rocky Mountain ecosystems, including plant health and the size and vigor of wildlife populations. Before I begin, I'll just share a bit of my background. I have a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental biology with a minor in physical geography, a master's in environmental science, and a PhD in natural resource geography, and all 3 degrees are from the University of Calgary in Alberta. During my 25-plus year coast-to-coast career with Parks Canada, I worked as a park naturalist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Waterton Lakes, and Kootenay National Parks, and then other positions in planning, research, and management in Western and Atlantic regions. From 2000 to 2012, I managed various programs for the British Columbia Provincial Ministry of Environment, including habitat protection, terrestrial ecosystem science, stewardship outreach, climate change adaptation for nature, and environmental policy. I retired from full-time government work in 2012. My husband, wildlife biologist Ian Hatter, and I now live in Invermere, British Columbia. In terms of my connection with the Great Divide Trail and the Great Divide Trail Association, I was one of the so-called original 6 on the Project Great Divide Trails crew in the summer of 1974, who surveyed the route between Waterton Lakes and Banff National Parks. I was one of the founders of the first Great Divide Trail Association, a past board member and past president for 1 term. I have hiked a lot of the GDT in sections over the years, although not anything north of Wilmore Wilderness Park yet. When the GDTA was resurrected in 2013, I rejoined and started volunteering on trail work parties and also writing articles for the GDTA's Pathfinder newsletter. Lastly, I am the compiler and editor of both editions of Tales from the Great Divide, vignettes on the origins and early history of Canada's Great Divide Trail and Great Divide Trail Association. This is a self-published compendium of stories from individuals involved firsthand in the start and development of the GDT and the GDTA, with the first or collector's edition published in 2019 and the second more complete edition published in 2021. Here is what I will cover in this talk. I'll outline where invertebrates, particularly worms and freshwater mollusks, fit within the hierarchy of life, biodiversity, and the animal kingdom, where worms and mollusks live in the Great Divide area, and their ecological roles. I will spend most of the time describing some of the different types of worms and freshwater mollusks that you could encounter or see evidence of along the GDT. And I'll wrap up with some suggestions on how we can safeguard nature along the GDT. Going back to the hierarchy of life diagram that I've shown in previous videos in this series, in this and the next 3 videos, I am focusing on the animal kingdom, the fauna that live in the vicinity of the Great Divide. When one considers the diversity of life on our planet, its biodiversity, the contribution of invertebrates is enormous. Taken as a whole, invertebrates constitute 80% of the Earth's species and over 95% of all animal species, constituting pervasive elements of every food web. Invertebrates are herbivores, predators, parasites, and decomposers, and they serve as food for other organisms. The Rocky Mountains are less biodiverse than many other environments, especially in terms of worms and mollusks, but there is still a great percentage of these invertebrate species here. By far, most animal species are classified as invertebrates, animals that lack a backbone or spinal column comprised of vertebrae containing the spinal cord or spinal nerve. The other group of animals are the ones we are most familiar with, the creatures with backbones, the vertebrates. They are the subject of future videos in this series. Invertebrates are soft-bodied, although mollusks develop shells to protect themselves. Most arthropods, the topic of the next video in this series, have exoskeletons. No invertebrates have lungs. They respire through their skin. Scientists classify invertebrates into several large groups, or what are called phyla. In the Great Divide area, one can find species from the 3 phyla of different types of worms, the flatworms, nematodes, and annelid worms, all of which are soft-bodied organisms, as well as another phylum containing freshwater mollusks, which manufacture shells for the protection of their soft bodies. The largest phylum within the invertebrates is that of the arthropods. So first of all, the worms and the mollusks, and then the arthropods, which include crustaceans, myriapods, arachnids, and hexapods. Those are the subject of the next video in the Nature of the Great Divide series. As I've mentioned in previous videos, in the vicinity of the Great Divide, altitude creates 3 major vegetation zones. Animals have the advantage of being able to move across these different vegetation zones. Nevertheless, you will encounter different invertebrate species at different elevations because due to the harsher weather conditions up high, it gets increasingly difficult for invertebrates, particularly worms and mollusks, to survive the higher up a mountain you go. So most species tend to live in the valleys and on the lower slopes of the montane forest zone. Fewer species are found in the subalpine forest zone, and the fewest species can survive in the alpine zone. Invertebrates such as worms and mollusks inhabit all terrestrial and aquatic habitats within the Great Divide area, and you're often unaware of them unless those organisms affect wildlife and or human health. Then they become very noticeable. Like other invertebrates, worms and mollusks play key roles in terrestrial ecosystem processes, particularly in the physical, chemical, and biological processes that link organisms and their environment. These include food web dynamics. These organisms aid in the biogeochemical and nutrient cycling, energy flow, as well within terrestrial ecosystems, as well as soil formation, all of which support the continuance of life, not only in the Rocky Mountains, but across the planet. Worms and mollusks play a key role in decomposing both plants and animals on land, and this adds valuable organic matter and nutrients to the thin mineral soil in the Rockies. This is equally true of the role of worms and freshwater mollusks in freshwater aquatic ecosystems in the vicinity of the Great Divide. Worms and snails maintain water quality by eating detritus. They serve as prey items for other invertebrates as well as vertebrates. They prey on single-celled organisms, including bacteria and protists. Many of them are parasites that affect the populations of fish and wildlife in the Canadian Rockies. In this video, I focus on species from the three phyla of worms, the flatworms, nematodes, and annelid worms, as well as species of freshwater mollusks, which in the vicinity of the Great Divide consist primarily of pond snails. Worldwide, there are at least 20,000 species of worms. The three worm phyla are flatworms, roundworms or nematodes, and segmented or annelid worms. There are species from all three groups in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. Flatworms are simple organisms lacking specialized circulatory or respiratory system. Unlike other so-called worms, their digestive system has only one opening. Oxygen and nutrients pass into their flat bodies through a process called diffusion. The group includes many parasites of vertebrates, such as tapeworms and liver flukes, as well as free-living flatworms found in the soil, leaf litter, and water. These tiny organisms can affect the range and abundance of wildlife populations, as well as the health of plants. Although carnivores are the definitive host for tapeworms, the larval forms reside in the viscera and body cavities of the intermediate hosts, which include fish, rodents, and ungulates. The giant liver fluke prefers to live in the liver of deer, elk, or moose. This large fluke's life cycle is complex. The larvae eat their way through the liver of their host. Infections in moose can disrupt their liver function and sometimes kill them. Planarians live in the freshwater and moist terrestrial environment. At 1.5 centimeters in length, they are so small, you likely won't see them. Besides cannibalizing each other, planarians prey on a variety of other organisms like water fleas and other tiny invertebrates, as well as consuming carrion. So if they weren't there, what you would see is a lot more rotting carrion and piles of leaf litter. Things would not get cleaned up. Nematodes, also known as roundworms, eelworms, or threadworms, have adapted to nearly every single ecosystem on the planet, including all three vegetation zones of Canada's Rocky Mountains. These unsegmented worms are abundant. The free-living ones that live in the soil or water of the Rockies are rarely noticed, as they are less than 1 millimeter in length. More obvious are the species that are parasites of plants, other invertebrates, or vertebrates. Some soil nematodes are herbivorous, some eat microbes, and others are predatory on bacteria, protists, fungi, and even other nematodes in the soil. According to a recent study, fewer species of nematodes are present in the soil of the coniferous forests in the northern Rocky Mountains than in the soil of valley grassland areas. Even fewer species can survive in the thin, poor soils of the alpine tundra. But amazingly, nematodes have been found in the soil even on mountain tops. Nematodes that feed on plant roots tend to be more diverse and numerous in grassland soil with its dense root network. They can reduce a plant's tolerance to drought by interfering with their uptake of water and nutrients, and they can transmit viral disease to plant hosts. Nevertheless, there are other soil nematodes that are absolutely essential for healthy ecosystems as they attack a huge number of insect and other plant pests. Annelids are segmented worms. As the name suggests, these creatures have their bodies divided into segments. Many species of annelids are hermaphroditic, with both male and female sex organs on each individual. This phylum includes oligochaetes, leeches, and the marine bristle worms. Biologists believe that only 8 species of native earthworm exist across all of Canada, a consequence of past glaciations. Most of these earthworm species are found along the west coast of British Columbia and in the Yukon in regions that were not glaciated during the last ice age. The native species appear to be rare, although since little is actually known about the native earthworms of Canada, there might be species that have yet to be discovered. However, settlers and their progeny introduced European and Asian earthworm species wherever they settled and gardened. These earthworm invaders colonized the soil under adjacent forests, sometimes disrupting soil ecology. If you see an earthworm while hiking on the GDT, it would be a big deal. And I'd encourage you to take a picture of it and report it. There are many leeches in the freshwater ponds in the Rockies. Leeches are an important part of forest and stream ecosystems because they act as both predators and prey in the life cycle of many animals. Carnivorous leeches feed on insect larvae, snails, crustaceans, other worms, and any dead animals they come across. They help clean up freshwater environments. However, there's a thing called the duck leech, which is a parasite on waterfowl. And infestations can actually be fatal, especially to ducklings, cygnets, and godwings. Tubifex, also called the sludge worm or sewage worm, is a species of segmented worm that inhabits the sediments of lakes and rivers on several continents, including North America, and it is here in the Canadian Rocky Mountains in its water bodies and water courses. These worms tend to be associated with detritus, muck, still water, and lower oxygen levels. So generally speaking, the areas that have poorer water quality. Like their cousins, the earthworms, they recycle nutrients. They clean up decaying algal mats, and they till the substrate of aquatic ecosystems. They play an incredibly important role in the food chain since they are a crucial food source for young and small fish and many other small aquatic predators. Unfortunately, the natural, usually beneficial behavior of Tubifex worms is inadvertently aiding in the spread of whirling disease in the aquatic environments near the Great Divide. In 2016, human beings unintentionally introduced a minute parasite called Mixobolus cerebrus, related to corals, anemones, and jellyfish, to Johnson Lake in Banff National Park, Alberta. Since then, the foreign parasite has spread to other aquatic habitats in the vicinity of the Great Divide. Native bottom-dwelling tubifex worms, as they filter the water, ingest the single-celled spores. Once swallowed, the spores alter their form, becoming something called triactinomyons, or TAMs for short, which can survive in the worm's gut. If a fish eats a tubifex worm containing these spores, it gets infected. TAMs also get released into the water when the tubifex worms defecate. The TAMs swim, seeking out young fish that are salmonids. They burrow into the fish, often entering the body through the gills. Once inside the fish, they damage the cartilage in an infected fish's backbone, causing the fish to swim in an abnormal whirling pattern, hence the name whirling disease. The infection kills juvenile fish, and specifically the ones that are salmonids, so trout, salmon, and whitefish. When an infected fish dies or gets eaten by a predator, the TAMs create tiny microspores that get released into the water. These microspores can hitch rides on anything in the water, even the bottom of your feet or the crevice just in your elbow, under your arm, anything, bottom of your stand-up paddleboard or canoe. So if there are tubifex worms in the pond or stream and they ingest the spores, that cycle starts all over again. The other group included in the annelids are the marine bristle worms. While there are currently no such creatures alive today that make their home near the Great Divide, 508 million years ago, when this area was at the edge of a huge ocean, one of the ancestors of today's annelid worms made their home. In 2018, scientists investigating the acclaimed Burgess Shales near the Continental Divide in what is now Kootenay National Park discovered and named a new fossil, naming it after Kootenay National Park. They found more than 500 fossils of this extinct bristle worm, which range in size from 1 millimeter to 3 centimeters. The tiny creatures would have been active in the sediment along the bottom of the Cambrian Sea, eating bits of organic material, just like marine bristle worms do in today's oceans. Like other invertebrates, freshwater mollusks play an important role in nutrient cycling. They function as decomposers, and they're also critical links in the food chain. In particular, freshwater snails or gastropods play important roles in nutrient cycling through the grazing of algae and decaying material. They're involved in complex ecological interactions, acting as intermediate hosts for multi-host parasites. They are also bioindicators of good water quality. Several species of freshwater snails live in freshwater aquatic habitats in the Rocky Mountains. Occasionally, while hiking the Great Divide Trail, you might see their shells by the shore of a receding lake in the Rockies, especially in the fall. The marsh ram's horn snail is primarily a detrivore, grazing on decaying plants, dead animals, and algae. In some circumstances, they may consume living aquatic plant tissues. They also play a role in the aquatic food web by serving as prey for other species such as fish, turtles, and birds. In addition, these pond snails are intermediate hosts for the larval stage of a variety of parasitic flatworms known as flukes or trematodes that can infect fish, waterfowl, and other animals. The marsh ramshorn snail is the unwitting intermediate host of the trematode Riberoria onadatrae, which is believed to be responsible for limb malformation in amphibians. The effects of this parasitic flatworm on amphibians, like these western toads, are devastating, and this parasite is responsible for declines in amphibian populations, not just in the Rockies, but all across Western North America. Freshwater snails, including the great pond snail and marsh ramshorn snail, are also the unwitting intermediate host for the flatworms that cause swimmer's itch. Human beings get off with just a painful skin rash that can be easily treated. However, the primary host sought is a water bird, particularly mergansers. These birds can get very sick from the infection, which adversely affects their circulatory and digestive systems. Ah, yes, and then there is the liver fluke. The huge number of species in the snail group, collectively known as pond snails, are the intermediate hosts for different species of liver flukes that cause infection in a whole variety of animals. The giant pond snail is associated with the transmission of the giant liver fluke in members of the deer family. And sadly, a BC government news bulletin reported an alarming new finding within an hour's drive of the GDT. Starting in February 2021, giant liver fluke infections were confirmed in several mature male bighorn sheep in the Radium Hot Springs area above the Columbia wetlands in British Columbia. Giant liver fluke was not previously reported in bighorn sheep in BC. Some infected sheep were thin, sick, and died, and that's how the infection was discovered after necropsies of the animals. And other infections were identified after death by vehicle collision. The number of bighorns infected in this herd is unknown. However, since this fluke is present in the area, if other sheep graze the nearby wetlands, they too may become infected. Parks Canada and provincial wildlife biologists are considering a whole range of management options. To wrap up this webinar, I will share a few thoughts on what we can all do to appreciate and safeguard nature on the Great Divide when we are on or off the trail. Although there are many excellent field guides that you can use to identify the flora and fauna of the Canadian Rockies, I don't know of any that help identify the species of worms and freshwater mollusks in the area. Your best bet is to use an app like iNaturalist if you are lucky enough to see and be able to photograph a worm or a mollusk while on a GDT. The apps are improving, although you cannot always trust the artificial intelligence identification, especially with more obscure organisms like worms and mollusks. Also, iNaturalist is very consumptive of iPhone resources, and it uses a lot of data. There are measures that you can take to avoid this. So just get on Google and type in how to reduce the battery usage by iNaturalist, and you'll get the instructions. It is a really good idea to record your observations on iNaturalist, though, as it improves our collective understanding of which species are where and when, including invasive alien worms and mollusks. One of the most important things you can do as a GDT hiker is to help safeguard nature during your trip by adhering to no trace backcountry travel principles. Just type in no trace backcountry principles in your browser and read the material under each of the 7 principles before you go. I'm just going to highlight one of them, and that is to prevent polluting the waters of the Great Divide area. Be sure to wash off any insect repellent and sunscreen before you jump in an alpine lake or stream in the areas where you are still allowed to swim. Better yet, use a portable shower and or a thermos to keep yourself clean at camp. Wash your dishes and do your morning ablutions with water that you take from the nearby water source and take it away from that water source. Never defecate or urinate near water sources, springs, wetlands, streams, rivers, ponds, or lakes. In case someone else did not do that, always filter the water you plan to use for drinking. Next to habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive alien species are the major threat to biodiversity. You can do your part to prevent the spread of invasive alien species into the Great Divide area. A key action is to clean your hiking boots and other gear before and after you hike the GDT. Before your trip, never bring firewood from outside the Great Divide area to a campground in the Rockies. If you fish, do not move worms or any other fishing bait species from one area to another, or release those bait species. Take pictures of any species that you suspect is an invasive alien species and post the pictures on iNaturalist after your trip. Report any confirmed sightings of alien invasive species, particularly worms and molluscs, to Parks Canada. Plants and animals that are not native to Canada can become aquatic invasive species if they are released into our waters. These aquatic invasive species can harm our environment, economy, and society. Under the federal aquatic invasive species regulations, it is illegal to introduce any aquatic species into a body of water where it is not native, unless authorized under federal, provincial, or territorial law. You can help prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species. And you can do this by never releasing aquarium pets, water, garden plants, live food, or live bait into rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, or even storm sewers. Sport fish may only be released back into the waters from which they were caught, i.e. catch and release, and never moved from one body of water to another. Other general measures to prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species include learning about them, including how to recognize them, and cleaning, draining, and drying any equipment used in the water before storing it or moving it to a different body of water. Cleaning means clean all mud, sand, plant, and animal materials from your watercraft and water-related gear. Draining means drain coolers, buckets, compartments, and other items that may hold water onto land before leaving the water body. Drying means dry for a minimum of 48 hours after use in BC, Alberta, or Canadian territories, including in the national parks, and a minimum of 30 days after use in the United States or in provinces other than BC, Alberta, and or the Canadian territories. Invasive alien zebra and quagga mussels from the Baltic Sea are currently still only wreaking havoc in the USA and the Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. They can survive out of the water for 18 to 30 days, which is why the dry quarantine period needs to be so long. In the fall of 2023, Parks Canada introduced a series of measures to try to slow or prevent the spread of whirling disease in the mountain national parks. These include prohibiting fishing, swimming, diving, or wading, or using a watercraft of any kind in any of the mountain national park waters. In the summer, people cannot hike, walk, or cycle within 3 meters of any watercourse or water body unless they are on an approved trail, bridge, or ford. One can collect treatable water for drinking and hygiene purposes. It's good to know that all of the efforts and investments that the GDTA and government land management agencies have made in recent years to build bridges over watercourses along the GDT will help people prevent the spread of whirling disease. That concludes my summary of the worms and mollusks, the first video on some of the invertebrate fauna in the Great Divide area. The next video in this series is on the arthropods, the most numerous of the invertebrate phyla, and the one that includes insects and ticks. If you have questions after listening to this video about the freshwater mollusks and worms that live in the vicinity of the Great Divide, please put them in the YouTube comments along with your contact information, and you will receive an answer. Thanks and happy hiking.